So, as some of you may know, I am 50% white, probably 40% black, and 93.6% communist. So, I'm here today to talk about why that score is so high on that, and also talk about my other political beliefs. Because I feel like if I'm going to have a political channel, it's kind of important to understand why and how I got to where I am today so that you can recognize political bias when you see it. My AP government teacher actually did the same thing when I was taught government. I think it's actually a useful thing to do because it's important to recognize where my biases lie and where, whenever I talk about things, to realize where that comes from. So, without further ado, let's get a little bit into it. So, I am, as of right now, most things tell me that I'm a social libertarian, which I would largely agree with that, but I was not that way originally. And I didn't even come from that. Most of my family is not left-leaning. I am the black sheep in this one. But I actually used to be very conservative, which is hilarious if you ever talk to me and know me now, because my stances are far, far from there. But it didn't happen overnight. It wasn't just like I met like one singular person and then I all of a sudden changed. It took, I'm young, I'm 18, but it took me probably 4 years, but a lot happened in that 4 years to actually get me where I am today. So without further ado, let me not waste time and get into that. So, I was born in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, which, to be fair, I never really lived there for any long amount of time. I've only visited there just to see family and stuff like that. So I don't really consider like Fort Lauderdale to be really core to my identity or anything like that. But just know, I was born in the South, pretty much. And my first couple memories are mainly me in a small little town called Cottonwood, Arizona. And I say it's a small little town. It's really small. I think most of the little mom and pop shops were starting to close down right before I left, but we lived there for a pretty long time. And to give you an idea of what sort of household and the political beliefs of that household, my dad was very conservative, very much like, free of the market, free of the people kind of person. Believed very much in Reaganomics, which if you guys don't know what Reaganomics is, it's mainly just the idea of lower taxes and getting the government out of the people's way while radically increasing military funding. Just the idea is if you spend a lot of money now, people don't go to war with you and you spend less money later. That's kind of the idea of it. But my dad was also retired from the military, medically discharged actually. He got an injury from howitzer falling on his back, which if you don't know what a howitzer is, I'll have a picture up on the screen. And just know those things weigh a ton. I don't know how he lived through that, but it's pretty impressive. Since the beginning of my life, though, I've been basically volunteering with the American Legion for, pretty much as long as I can remember. As long as I can volunteer, I think I've been working with the American Legion. I don't anymore, and I kind of wish I would volunteer a little bit more now, but it is what it is. So, obviously, I went to elementary school in Cottonwood, and I volunteered quite a bit, but eventually, after a few disputes between my mom and dad and a couple other things, it wasn't a very great relationship between my mom and my dad, quite frankly, and they were divorced at the time, so that doesn't really help the situation either. But after a while, I eventually moved to another small town in Florida called Cape Coral, or Cape Coral, that's how it's actually pronounced, but people call it Cape Coral because I guess they really, really hate themselves. But I went to a middle school that wasn't very diverse. I'm going to bring up diversity because it is somewhat important. But I went to a middle school and it wasn't very diverse, just a bunch of other kind of suburban kind of kids. Cape Coral was mainly full of retired veterans and, old people. It's like Florida. You basically go there to die. It's a sunny state. Eventually, you go there to retire, though, for most people. And my middle school was pretty uneventful. I counted a few things I'm not really comfortable talking about today, but I did meet a couple friends, and it's the longest place I've ever stayed in. And so, while middle school wasn't eventful, high school definitely was a lot more A lot more. My high school wasn't as diverse still. It's just the kind of town it is. It's mainly full of sort of white with German background mainly. But I actually started to become really frustrated with school. Not because of like the workload. I've gotten very accustomed to schoolwork at this point. I've done it for most of my life. I don't really care. But I kind of became frustrated with how there were obvious problems with it, but things weren't changing. Or that the teachers were very hard on certain students and not the others and things like that. It started to dawn on me kind of how frustrating our school system is here in America. I'm not sure about other places entirely, but I started taking AP classes, which AP classes are what introduced me to the idea, a lot of liberal ideology, right? Because AP is it's very liberal. It really is. Most big colleges, I should say, are. But I started taking it, and it also first introduced me to the idea of kind of like diversity and really, really thinking about society and what we want to do with it. Because AP, for all its faults, I will give it credit for being that it really does motivate you to actually think of kind of like the big picture and really come up with your own solutions, but it also wants to introduce you to a lot of different ideas. Keep in mind this was AP Lang, and while AP Lang is mainly focused about writing, we covered a lot of like societal issues and problems. Gender was probably the most interesting unit since it talks mainly about how gender affects our society and the sort of social norms and other things that affect it. However, while I took AP classes and all that, and this isn't necessarily completely in chronological order, as well, me taking AP classes didn't happen until my junior year of high school. During my sophomore and early junior year, though, I became very, very depressed. It was bad. I'm not going to go into it too much just because it's not really the point of the video, but just know during this time I was extremely depressed and it was causing me issues. But also during this time, I also met my second girlfriend at the time, and it was a very, very toxic relationship. I'm talking you don't want to be in this one. Very much back in the forth, you try as hard as you can and nothing comes of it, sort of thing. But that's kind of also important too to my political beliefs, because it kind of introduced me. She herself kind of introduced me to way more progressive stuff. Like I'm talking about this woman was SJW territory, which I don't care for SJWs. They kind of annoy the hell out of me. Like, don't get me wrong, I believe in progressive ideas, but SJWs piss me off. They're just annoying and they go way too far in what they think is a good system. But around the same time, I also questioned my faith in God, which that's a big no-no. But I started questioning it. My dad, even though he was kind of not really quite like a Bible-thumping Christian type, but he very much, religion was core to his beliefs, but he did let me actually believe how I wanted to and kind of go on my own journey about me either not believing God or believing in him or taking other religions, which I actually have a lot of respect for him for doing that. Even though religion was really core to his identity, he didn't try and impose it on myself. But eventually I kind of had this struggle with, do I believe, do I not? What does that mean? In which case, what is my purpose, sort of thing? And eventually I did get through it all, but it took a long time. And I kind of got some help from other people along the way, which I'll introduce a little bit in a bit. But around the same time, I actually started using social media a lot more. And I also got into editing, which is probably evident in some of the YouTube videos I have on here, which I think I've mainly hidden or gotten rid of. I hope, because they were pretty bad. I was like freshman year and I just started learning how to edit, and they're not good videos. I hope I have hidden them far from the prying eyes of anybody. And at the same time, I actually got a computer, which was a huge thing for me because it kind of allowed me to really branch out into these very, very different communities, not just for gaming, but also political groups and stuff like that. And also editing communities, getting really heavily into content creation motivates you to actually talk to all these different people. And also pushed me to be a lot more extroverted and actually talk to as many people as I can, because I found talking to people was very interesting, as they all have their own beliefs and ideas, and they have their own reasons for justifying it and things like that. But I'm not going to get too much into it, or else this video is going to be over 20 minutes, and I really don't want that. 2016 election, though, was probably when I became interested in politics, simply because, well, it was a turbulent year to say the least, and none of the candidates were all that great, and I think it rubbed off on everybody. It was kind of hard not to be political at the time, just because, I mean, you either loved or hated Donald Trump, or you loved or hated Hillary Clinton, or you hated them both and tried to compromise. And of course, at the time, I probably would have picked Trump. As far as I believe now, that might be different, but I don't know. The 2016 election was ass, and the whole Russia thing, it was just chaotic. It was like a political reality TV show, like Britain is at times. But eventually, though, I met someone who was very, very interesting. This was a person who's traveled the world almost. Like, I'm talking literally went to Japan, traveled most of Europe. And that's rare for me. Most of the people who were in Cape Coral were like born and raised here in Florida, sort of thing. When I say here in Florida, I'm in Kansas. Kansas and Florida, two different things, radically different things, whatever. But she had, at the time, what I would consider pretty radical beliefs. She was bordering socialism in a lot of cases. And I had a huge respect for her, because she's actually traveled a lot of the world, got to see a lot of these different systems and countries, which made me interested in hearing out her ideas. Like, she's actually gone through and lived through some of these things that she's talking about. So when she says things that are kind of almost socialist sounding, it makes you think about it, because it's like, well, I thought socialism was bad and that these are very radical, stupid beliefs. Why is she believing in them? But I heard her out, and it's kind of what pushed me to really think differently, not just in the lines of just America, but also think about political beliefs all over the world, not just America. That, like, the world is very expansive. The world is not just America. Please don't ever think that way. The world is far from just America. Although America likes to stick its dick and everything, but hey, whatever. And eventually, though, after meeting all these great, wonderful people, there's still a lot of toxicity around me, either from my ex or from other friends, some drugs and stuff like that. It was a toxic environment to be in. So eventually I decided to move away off to Kansas, the great nothingness that is Kansas. So Kansas was interesting, right? I think I had a lot of built-up ideas what Kansas was supposed to be, because you have built-up ideas of what Midwest rural America is going to be like, and I figured I was probably not going to like it that much. But actually, Kansas, in my personal opinion, very subjective opinion, is better than Florida. Believe it or not. It mainly has to do with the people, honestly. I feel like, for me, mainly it's the people that actually make a difference, because Florida, yeah, it's cool, it's nice, it's a kind of, depending on where you live, it's either kind of culturally diverse, so you get like these really interesting foods, but the people are just assholes. Like, they are absolute jackasses. But I went to a school here in Kansas that was very large and very diverse. Like, it was a huge difference from being in my school in Cape Coral. I'm not going to mention any names, because then you could use that, track me down, blah, 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 blah. I don't feel like getting doxxed. And it actually introduced me to even more weird ideas, as now you have people from the Philippines, you have people who went to Korea and came back, you have people who are like Cuban or Puerto Rican. Like, having such a diverse range of people was actually interesting, because you get to sample all these different cultures and things like that. At around the same time, I took an AP government class, who was taught by a Democrat teacher. I want to emphasize that, because there's whenever you teach politics, there's always going to be a semblance of your opinion in there, because it's like impossible to not teach politics with some bias in it. But doing AP government got me super, super interested in politics. Now, because understanding the American system and why we have it the way it is makes you really, really, really want to change things. Because, oh boy, our country is not even what the framers intended, if you ask me. Now, I'm not saying that we should go to what the framers intended, but I am saying that it is far different from them, and I can't really say it's for the better. Around the same time, though, I took interest in the Democratic nominees, just because it was kind of my first. This is essentially my first election that I'm fully taking part in, right? So I want to, get to know the nominees, get to know their ideas, and this is when I started to become really, really frustrated with the DNC, right? Because they were pushing Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren so hard, and I hated it, right? Because we all know Trump was going to be the presumptive nominee. We knew he was going to fucking win. The incumbent almost always wins their primary, so unless you, really fucked up. But I became very frustrated with the Democratic Party because they kept pushing Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren. And it's like, why? Why? These candidates are not good. They're not good. They're not for the people. They're very much just corporate chills almost. Elizabeth Warren at least sounds nice. But during the Democratic nominees, I got interested in Andrew Yang, Tulsi, and Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie was I didn't really know too much about him, and I wasn't really interested in his policies at first. However, a person kind of pushed me to actually look into what he believes, because they were great, they were into, oh geez, I hit my desk. They were really into Bernie Sanders, kind of a little bit of unhealthy degree, but they were for him pretty much, right? So I decided, screw it, I'm gonna look into it. Why do people like this guy? And eventually, this radical person who sounded like a crazy old man, sounded to he made more sense than a lot of people do, and when that happens to you, it makes you really question what is radical and what is not, because you're listening to someone who sounds crazy, right? And then you look into why he says these things. Suddenly, all the people who don't think like him sound kind of crazy, or who don't not essentially think like him, but people who are opposite of him almost sound nuts. Like the people who think that Bernie is insane, or that he's an extremist. It's kind of are you sure? Because he really doesn't sound that radical to me. He actually sounds like he has good ideas. But getting to familiar with Bernie's policies and why he believes them is kind of what pushed me to not just becoming liberal, but becoming almost nearly socialist at that point. I still wasn't very comfortable with the term socialist, so it was just kind of whatever at that point. It was just I think I can actually get behind a little bit of this whole socialism thing, sort of thing. And then I took an interest in how other countries ran their government, right? And I started looking at statistics for other countries too, and it really clearly showed to me that whatever America's doing, it ain't working well. And this comes from someone who knows the government in America pretty intimately. I try to know it as much as I can. Now, I can't know everything. I think it's physically impossible with a system this large and complex, but I have, I would say, a good understanding of what the American government is. And that's why I have an AP government class for it, right? And when I started looking at other countries, I started sitting here and I was thinking, why is America lagging behind so much? And you see that people, other countries can do sometimes almost the exact same thing that we're afraid of doing, like single-payer healthcare, and do it efficiently and way more effectively than we can. Some countries' spending per capita is way lower than ours, and they can even have populations bigger. Are not necessarily bigger, but they have populations similar in size than ours. Take for Britain is kind of bloated too, where they have a lot of spending per capita for kind of no reason. But a lot of it was, the more I looked at it, it seemed more to do with inefficiencies than it actually did with, just population size. And part of that, I think, maybe because of how widespread America is. Same thing with how sometimes widespread Britain can be. But that's a whole different story for another video. But just know that I became very interested in other countries, and I was starting to see where America was lagging behind in a lot of ways. Around the same time, though, the extradition riots, protests, whatever you want to call it, the extradition bill was being introduced in Hong Kong, and there was riots over it, right? Now, of course, I supported the democracy for Hong Kong because you would be kind of nuts not to. Either that or China's paying you. But I very much supported Hong Kong, and I think I even have, if you go into my Discord server, I still have hashtag FreeHK on it, because I believe that strongly that Hong Kong deserves democracy. And I don't think Britain can take it back, and I don't think they'll ever get it, but I still believe strongly that all people deserve democracy. They should have the right to choose how their government works. But I also, around this time, started realizing I was becoming socialist. Like, without a doubt, I was starting to become socialist, not necessarily all the way to where I am now, but more of like a democratic socialist at this point, which is kind of where some people are in the Democratic Party right about now. And I started taking on very populist beliefs, very, very much about for the people, by the people sort of thing, which technically is what our country was founded on, was populist beliefs. But eventually I started to become more comfortable with my radical ideas, right? I don't have to necessarily talk about them all the time, and sometimes I'll keep my mouth shut just to never, start an argument. But I started to get more comfortable with these beliefs and realize they weren't as radical as people made them out to be. I guess because, we have our Cold War mentality still. And eventually I started realizing I wanted radical change of the American government. I realized I was not happy with how the American government is, and I really wanted it to change for the better. And this was not helped by the fact that COVID started coming out around the end of my senior year of high school, which absolutely, after seeing what other countries were doing in action as this pandemic was spreading, it made me completely, utterly annoyed and frustrated as hell with the American government and how it's reacted so far. Not even just the American government, but also the American people as a whole. Well, I shouldn't say the American people as a whole, but a couple of these minorities, but still extremely loud beliefs. And they weren't just minority beliefs. Sometimes it also felt like there was some people sympathize with them slightly, but not entirely. But it frustrated me to no end to watch other countries handle this pandemic, thank you, words, that they handled it so well. Like, South Korea and New Zealand are doing pretty damn fine by themselves right now, and they're largely done with this pandemic. Now, there is still the second wave that's supposedly set to happen in the fall, but I imagine they're going to handle it just as well as they've done when the pandemic first came around. South Korea is definitely probably one of the biggest and best examples of how to do COVID right. And other countries did it even better than ours. I mean, I would say South Korea is kind of like the golden standard on what to do, but other countries handled it way, way better than America did, and that's reflected in the statistics, where China originally was supposed to have almost everyone infected, and now we go to America with our reporting system broken practically, and we still have way, way, way more numbers than others. But it led me to be very frustrated with our government, to not trust it anymore. But around a little bit into the pandemic, though, I started helping out my mom with some of her college work, and it introduced me to one philosopher. You may know his name, and you may hate him or love him or whatever you think of him, right? But I learned about Karl Marx, right? And I specifically became very interested in his philosophies because I found myself agreeing with him to kind of a scary degree, which normally, I mean, whenever you hear Karl Marx, you just think communism, right? You immediately think communism, and communism is bad. That's just how you're conditioned for the most part if you live in America. However, I started looking more and more into believed, and I all of a sudden, what was this thing that communism bad didn't even sound that bad anymore. Now I'm not As much as the tests say so, I'm not actually going to advocate for communism. Sorry, just it's not going to happen. Communism basically falls under its own weight unless you have a very specific, almost against human nature kind of people. So I don't, not going to support communism. However, I think if people were a little bit different, then communism actually would probably be, if not the best system, it'd be a very fucking good system. But that's a whole different story. Maybe I'll get into it if you guys are interested. But I started to read into him, and I agreed so much with what his beliefs were. And it started to push me even further to the left and further libertarian. Because I looked at what he says, and I kept agreeing with him. I couldn't really find a reason to disagree other than his ideal society. And it just kept constantly pushing me into, I guess, a more radical belief system. Not necessarily because I hated everything or something like that, but more because I started to see why he wanted things the way they are now. I started to see why he believed that capitalist societies and commercialism and all these things were just so bad in what they potentially do to people, and wanting to see a government that actually was designed to try and not only further society, but also allow for the most immense personal freedom to actually do whatever the hell you want. But as I got into him, just around the same time, the protests in America, the big one, the enormous BLM protests, which again, this video was already long enough. I'm not going to go into the entirety of the protests, but I will say that the BLM protests drawed a little bit of a conflict out of me, because I supported the Hong Kong protests through and through. Even if they were rioters, even if they were looters, I supported that protest. That was the hill I was going to die on. But when the BLM protests first started, I kind of soured on it at first because of the rioters and the looters. I fully didn't like the fact that they were being completely violent, but in my head, all I could think was well, I mean, if you're a black person in America, like I am, well, not necessarily, just mixed. I don't know, you can consider me black or white, whichever. I mainly grew up in a white community, though, so sometimes I'm just say I'm white, but put down I'm black for the most part. I guess you can say I'm, culturally white. I don't know what the fuck you want to call it. Whatever, I'm just a mixed mutt. I supported the Hong Kong protests, but at the same time I was souring on this. And as much as I was souring on it, though, I kind of understood where the rioters were coming from. I kind of understood where Antifa was coming from when they did do violent things. Now, some of them are just taking advantage. However, with people out of jobs and frustrated with how the government's responded to this, and now seeing all these cases of police brutality, and it all falling on deaf ears because Congress doesn't want to do jack shit, and the executive branch doesn't do anything about it either. And it's just, it makes you frustrated. It makes you upset. And it left me really depressed for a while because I couldn't resolve that conflict in my own head. Eventually I did. And it came from MLK and JFK. And it was this. When the reason why people are rioting isn't because they just hate America necessarily. It isn't because that they just want to see it burn. It's because over a decade of inaction has occurred, and they've protested, and they've constantly tried and fought it out. They try and voted for people. They went out and they tried to protest peacefully. They went out and they tried to have their voices heard, and to say people that, our lives matter too, and that the police should not be acting like they are with us. But it kept falling on deaf ears. Okay, whatever. Deaf ears. And eventually I came to realize that these people, they aren't rioting. Well, not all. These people aren't rioting just because they just want to see America burn, or they're just they get some weird hate boner thing from setting things on fire, but it's because they are frustrated that they have tried to speak peacefully, that they've tried to plead and cry and do everything they can, that they can put out videos of police brutality all day long, and yet no one listened. So eventually you get to a point where, like, I don't have a job. Like, at that point, you can just say, I don't have a job anymore. COVID put me out of one. The communities are treating me like shit. I'm angry. You know what? If they won't listen to me speak, then maybe they'll listen. Maybe they'll listen to the world essentially burning. And this is what they're doing. And this is why it's happening. And that conflict I had in my head that was against the violence eventually resolved. And it said, yes, non-violence is the best way to go about protests. But who am I to say that a government formed by the people for the people, that the people don't have a right to go burn it down if they believe so? Hell, I know this is going to be kind of a weird analogy, but Germany even voted itself out of power, essentially. They voted out of democracy, which is a weird concept. But when you look at it that way, if the people are to decide exactly what government they want, then that means it is almost their right to go burn it down if they believe that that's what's actually going to cause change. And while I don't support them being violent, I think MLK's confrontational but still peaceful approach was probably the best. I understand why, and rectifying that difference in my head was probably the thing that pushed me to having not just very collectivist beliefs, but also very libertarian beliefs, because I don't think the government should decide how you live your life. I think the government is there to help try and take care of everyone, to try and help out. However, the government is not there to decide what is moral, what is good, and what's bad. It's an objective institution that should be there only to help people out and to help solve some of the issues of social inequality. However, it just leaves you the fuck alone after that. The government doesn't need to legislate morality into law. That's for the culture of that society to decide, and for the people to decide that. It is not the government's place to do so. So, I mean, if you look at my beliefs, yeah, I'm pretty radical. But the whole point of this video is to explain that what is seemingly a radical idea, and, well, the video has other things, because I also wanted to show the fact that what my political beliefs are, but for anyone who thinks that something is too radical, right, I have just a couple things to say. Not the Nazis were technically too radical at their time, but something that is seemingly radical doesn't mean it is impossible, and it doesn't even mean that it isn't accomplishable. Matter of fact, it doesn't even mean that it's bad, technically. You know, at the time of America's founding, the whole idea of a Confederate state, of just essentially, like, 13 different countries all trying to band together, sort of? Kind of? Yeah, that was a pretty crazy idea at the time, and to be fair, it didn't really work out. But the point is to say that even if something seems radical, that doesn't mean it's bad. And it doesn't even mean that you shouldn't believe in it. It just means that when you look at the political compass, it just tends to be on the edge. That's about all it means. Unless you believe, like, legitimately in, like, Stalinism or fascism, really, if they're radical beliefs, it's fine. It really is. Don't be afraid to believe in something just because it seems like it's too far out. That's what the whole stupid-ass Cold War mentality was about, was just defeating these radical ideologies, they said. Don't be afraid to believe in something, no matter how stupid it sounds to other people. Don't let people put your beliefs down. If you truly believe in something, you should advocate for it, and you should fight for it. Now, am I gonna serve the military for America? No, that's not the hill I'm gonna die on. I don't really care for this country that much, right? But the point is to say that yes, I believe in radical beliefs. Sure. You can say that I'm a commie, or you can call me an anarchist or whatever, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that even I believe any of those things. Like I said, I don't believe in communism. I don't believe in anarchy. I'm a social libertarian. Yes, libertarian is right above anarchy, and yes, socialism is right above communism, but they're not the same thing. And it's important to believe that don't associate socialism with communism. They're not the same thing. Same thing with anarchy and libertarianism. They are not the same thing. And just because you may hear that, well, chaos is gonna just all of a sudden run rampant if you're a libertarian, that's not necessarily true. There's facts and studies and other things that you can use to support your belief. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to believe all this marketing hype, almost like hype BS, to sit here and think, oh yeah, it's just going to lead to anarchy. No. Same thing with the slippery slope argument. All the time I hear, if you become socialist, then eventually it's going to go communist, right? For one, the slippery slope argument was Karl Marx used for capitalist societies, that it's going to swing back radically if you don't become socialist. That was Karl Marx's idea, actually. So, again, if you have a belief, go fight for it. Honestly, don't just become apathetic towards everything, because that's how we get people like Nazis and Stalinism and stuff like that, is because good people sit around and don't do anything. If you have a belief, no matter how dumb or how shit you think it is, or how radical you think it is, or how no one you think will ever support it, you'd be surprised. Honestly, I didn't know till recently that there actually were people who were socialists. I thought that was a crazy ideology, and look where I am now. So please, if you have a belief, whether that's right, again, unless you're like fascist or Stalinism, I just, those two things, probably just don't talk, please, just don't. You should fight for your beliefs. And yeah, that's it. That's why I'm a social libertarian. Obviously it's a lot more complex than that, but it's more complex than I can sum up in an hour-long video or even a 2-hour-long video. There's many, many, many reasons, but I want to give you guys an idea of why I believe the way I do. So that way, when I make political videos in the future, you understand my perspective, and for one, why I believe a certain way, and my political biases that exist. So, anyway, I have no good outro yet, so you're just gonna have to deal with me saying bye every time. I know that's very boring. Bye is very boring. But that signing out thing I used to do was very cringy, and that was like a thing I used to do in like freshman year of high school. So it is not going to happen anymore. So